The topic of my talk is resilience, or in this case, by resilience I mean adaptation to climate change. There was a time, not particularly long ago, when it was considered wrong to talk about adaptation, risky certainly. And the idea was that if we were to talk about adaptation to climate change, we'd undermine any work going on mitigation. If we were to talk about adaptation and resilience, that people might be inclined to go, well, I don't need to do anything, systems don't need to change, we'll just adapt. But the argument I want to make is that the time for those arguments is long past, and the time for talking about adaptation and resilience is now. So what I'd like to do is to just set the scene a little and then talk through three topics: resilient buildings, resilient cities, and resilient people. Just talk a little bit about some of the things that have been going on and some of the things where certainly work needs to be done yet. And then just a few final thoughts on what that might mean for us as a community who are interested in sustainability and trying to make the world more sustainable. So if I can ask you to cast your mind back to some headlines you might have seen over recent years. So in 2016 we saw heat waves and wildfires across Europe, loss of life in several countries. We saw droughts and as well as floods in East Africa, hurricanes hitting the east coast of Africa that were the strongest on record at that time. Rolling forward to 2018, temperature records fell across the northern hemisphere. Wildfires in the Arctic Circle were news at the time. This year we've seen heat waves in India, we've seen heat waves in Europe. At the same time as the heat waves in Europe, Mexico had a hailstorm with over 1 metre of hail in the streets. And of course Hurricane Dorian in the last few weeks. And there's much else that we can put up there, but I'd actually say this is no longer news to us. This is something we're becoming very used to seeing on a regular basis. And for those of us interested in sustainability, it also means that what we're seeing is very much what climate scientists have been predicting for the last 30 years. So we're seeing it in the newspapers on a daily and a weekly basis. The fact that we're seeing that is to very much and very clearly is evidence that the argument that climate change is coming in some decades and it's going to hit countries elsewhere is no longer tenable. It's here now, it's happening around the world. So adaptation to the changing world is something that we need to be thinking about. And when I'm talking about adaptation, just want to give you an idea of some of the things that might involve, and for the UK, because some of this certainly is contextual. There's a list there that I've drawn from the Adaptation Subcommittee, which is a subcommittee to the Climate Change Committee, a body that reports to the UK government. And the Adaptation Subcommittee reports every 2 years. They talk about what needs to be done, they talk about what has to be done, what priorities are for action, for research. But that's just to give you an idea of the scope of what they're talking about. So in addition to various types of flooding and overheating, one of the interesting things there also is psychological impacts. Because of course when there's an adverse weather effect, a serious storm or flooding, people are very disturbed and distressed by this, and that doesn't necessarily go once the waters recede and they can get back into their homes. So interestingly, that's also on the government agenda. So I'm not going to, in the 20 minutes I have, or slightly less, try and talk through all of that. I just want to pick out a couple of topics and just talk about the sort of things that have been going on and some gaps. So thinking about buildings first and the sort of things we now know about adapting buildings to the changing climate. A lot has been done on flooding. There's been some great talks here. Colin's talk yesterday on Teletubbies and suds, a great example. But the planning system has also been changed, so that there's now a requirement that any development in flood zones or anywhere near watercourses has to have Environment Agency involvement. So the system has changed there to make sure flooding is very much part of development and planning approvals. Technically, also lots of good work has been done, and if you have a chance at any point to go to the Building Research Establishment in Watford, on their campus there, they have a flood home, which has got some excellent examples of how to bring together technologies to protect buildings, homes in particular, from the ingress of water in the first place, then if water does come in, how it can be got out as efficiently as possible, and if there is a flood event, how repair can be done as simply as possible. They've brought together quite a lot there from tiling that's water resistant, to the idea of electric sockets at countertop level and wired from above so water doesn't get into the electrics. Plastering, if plastering is necessary, to use plasterboard, which is horizontally laid rather than vertically, so that the bottom board can be taken out for repair. And a lot more. So some excellent examples of how the understanding of technology and construction processes can be brought together to say there is an awful lot that can be done to protect buildings. On the other side of the coin, there is a retrofit program to try and introduce some of those technologies to flood vulnerable homes. But the Adaptation subcommittee has noted that the rate of increase of vulnerability in homes, it actually outstrips that retrofit program by about 5 times. So it's just not keeping up with. So we know what can be done, but we're just not keeping up in terms of protecting people's homes and businesses. Another point is that the Environment Agency is working with the construction industry, they've said, and to put together a code of practice for new builds as to what can be done. But this code of practice is going to be voluntary, and I think many of us here will know how effective voluntary codes of practice in the industry are. So some good understanding, some good thinking there, but quite a lot still that has to happen. Moving on to overheating and the danger of heat waves to people in their homes. Again, the recommendations have been around for quite some time now. So Public Health England has published them, the National House Building Council also. There's quite a lot that can be done to retrofit buildings to protect occupants. But there's also a body of academic research, quite a lot of studies going back 10 years and more, around the country showing that overheating, and not necessarily only climate related, is an issue already. And although a lot of the studies are very small scale, they are real world studies, instrumented studies, and they've taken place in a variety of conditions and showing that overheating is there already. And their findings was borne out by work we did a couple of years ago, 2016, where we did a large scale study in the south of the country, and found that 2/3 of the respondents had already experienced overheating in their homes. So it's happening already. What we also found was that people had some awareness of the sort of things they could do to protect their homes. But when we asked them about their intention to make those changes, we found very, very low intention to make changes. And from a psychological point of view, that actually isn't surprising, because it's well understood. There's a concept called the risk perception paradox, which is that even when people are aware of risk, it doesn't mean they're necessarily triggered to behave, to act, to try and change that risk. Which is an issue, it's a known issue, but unfortunately government policy still assumes that if people are aware of risk, they'll go out and do something about it. As I say, the psychological evidence is no, it is actually more complicated than that. So, with resilient buildings, as I say, some understanding, more to do, and then turning to resilient cities. Thinking about cities, we know, of course, that it's not simply a matter of scale. We're not just talking about the issues around buildings, just simply scaling up to try and protect our cities. When we're thinking about resilient cities, it's very much the systemic approach is important. To think about cities as almost as ecosystems in their own right. They're not just systems, but they're systems of systems that are interconnected. So when we think about, for example, health systems, telecommunications, water, food, these are all systems within cities that have interdependencies. And in the work that's been done on resilience in cities and on urban resilience, the two approaches have come out. One is deemed sort of an engineering perspective, and the idea there is that when there's a shock event, the best thing to do is to put things back as they were, to build back, to get the functionality back up and running, and then go on as before. But there's a countervailing argument which is talked about as a socio-ecological one, and it's drawn from understanding of how nature adapts. And the thinking there is that actually after a shock event, it's important to try and adapt and learn from that, so that what gets put back is stronger, is more capable of withstanding a similar event and other events in the future. There's been some really good work done on this by Arup and Lloyds, and they tried to draw out some of the principles about protecting cities and urban resilience. So amongst their top principles, obviously the idea about preventing failure, so maintaining assets so that there isn't a failure, but also the need for integrated planning, that idea of there are systems of systems in the city and they need to be talking together. And they also point out that where there's a drive for efficiency in systems, lean systems, that often means they're far more prone to failure. So if there isn't redundancy in a system, any single failure can bring down the system. And as I say, the interconnection of systems means that can have knock-on effects. So they're talking about the idea that actually redundancy and robustness needs to be built in. The second principle that they put forward is the idea that expediting recovery, so actually planning for failure. So in thinking about resilience, they're thinking about more than climate-related resilience, but they're putting forward the idea that we must accept that shock events will happen and we need to be able to recover. So that should be part of the planning. So it's important to understand, for example, how emergency access can be got to various places, how the service in particular is protected so that it can withstand problems elsewhere. And again, they talk about interagency coordination. And the third principle they talk about is this of recovering better, of learning from what's happened, so that what is put back in place means that there is greater resilience to future events. Their emphasis on planning and forward planning is an interesting one. It tied in with some work that we had done last year, where we worked with town planners, urban planners, to understand what they understood about resilience. And what we found through interviews with 40 planners was that, in fact, resilience wasn't something they were dealing with. It wasn't something they brought into their decisions on approving or not approving developments. And in some cases, they were talking about it in the future, saying it's early days. So what we have here is quite a disconnect. We've got good understanding, good scholarship on the kind of concepts that we need to be thinking about and what that might mean. But we still have a structure where certainly at a planning level, where that's just not part of day-to-day planning. It's just, there may be emergency planning going on in local authorities, and I think most have capacity for doing that, but it's not tied in with the decisions that have been made about the built environment on a weekly basis. Okay, so I've talked about resilient buildings and about resilient cities very briefly. I think we also need to add to our list of things we're interested in as a built environment community the idea of resilient people. In talking about both buildings and cities, what I've talked about is the technology but also the processes around resilience. And in order to have those processes work, to be able to put things back, to build back better, we need resilient people. So looking at what the literature has to say on resilient people, the interest in this started in child development, interestingly, where researchers were interested in why, when children had adverse experiences in their childhood, some would go on to suffer throughout their lives. Maybe, if they'd grown up in poverty, maybe never managed to break out of that, and never managed to achieve much joy in their life. But they could find examples as well of people who had problems in childhood, but overcame those and went on to flourish. Really interested in what makes the difference. Why do some people thrive and some people don't? The first thoughts on it were that it's a trait. So it's a personality, a stable personality, a part of a personality, so you are or you're not. But as the work developed, they realised that actually it's not a binary. It's not all resilient or not. There are different components of resilience. And so they've started, there's work on identifying what those components might be. So some of the components that have been understood is physical resilience, the idea that if you're fitter or stronger or more mobile, you're more capable of withstanding or recovering from illness or injury. There's work on mental resilience. And here a lot of the work is about self-regulation and self-control, the idea that for some people they are more capable of setting a goal and working to it, putting aside distractions, putting aside maybe the noise that City was talking about, and focusing on a goal, paying attention and achieving something in the future. And so there are ways in which those kind of abilities can actually be strengthened. There's understanding of emotional resilience, and here the work has been very much around the balance between negative and positive emotions. And the findings have been that if people have too many, that balance isn't right, and have a strong tendency towards negative emotions in their lives, then they're less resilient to the next problem that comes along. And again, that opens up the door for interventions of trying to help people to get that balance right. They talk about a balance of 4 or 5 to 1, positive emotions to negative. that if that balance can be skewed in that direction, then people have a bit more resilience when they have to deal with problems. And a final one to mention is social resilience, and this has been seen to be really important. It's around the idea that social networks are important for how we deal with life, for how we can cope. It can affect physical health, it can affect longevity. So when we talk about social resilience, we're talking about sort of positive relationships. And the findings are that there are so many resources that can be brought to us through social networks, through social relations, whether it's an ear to rant to when you're having a bad day, or more seriously where people need sort of a welcoming ear when there are mental health problems. But it can go into sort of physical resources as well, of knowing somebody who says, yes, you've got a problem, and I know somebody who can help you with that, or even physical resources of a roof over your head for the night or whatever. Many, many ways in which social networks help people build resilience and allow people to deal with the sort of knocks that life might throw at them. But interestingly, that idea of social resilience is in the individual, but as individuals, we're never in isolation. We're always very much part of groups. And there is understanding in the same way, and interestingly in the same way, that cities are not just an amalgamation of buildings. Resilience at a group level is not just the sum of resilience at individual level. So work that's been done with communities that have suffered particularly adverse events like Katrina in New Orleans, they found that there are particular properties of groups and communities that come together really well. And in part, the resilience of individuals is there, but there are also emergent properties of the group. So one is group cohesiveness, where the group feels very much as a group. People are identifying with the group, they feel part of it. Cohesive groups that have a common narrative about what's happened and why it's happened tend to be able to respond better, and particularly where there are common goals. So where the group is thinking, okay, we know where we are, why we got here, and we're also agreeing on where we need to go. They have more of an ability then to try and bring together resources to try and protect themselves and move forward. And understanding that means that in responses to adverse events, shock events, the emergency responses can try and enhance those kind of factors in a group to try and make sure that the group is then strengthened in what it can do. So there were the three topics I wanted to briefly mention: resilient buildings, resilient cities, resilient people. And so just a few thoughts then on what that might mean for us as a community interested in sustainability. And what I think it should mean is that we are already thinking and talking about resilience and adaptation as part of what we do. And very much seeing that sustainability is no longer cannot include the idea that to be sustainable is meant to be resilient to the changing world. I've been very heartened in the great talks yesterday, resilience did come up several times, so I think we're beginning to make that move. But it is important that we don't ignore the world that's changing around us as we get on with our research. And my final point would be to build your own resilience, to be aware that to work in sustainability often is a tough call, and to look at resilience in your own life, particularly support networks. The final thing I'd like to leave you with is what I think is a fantastic example of resilience. This was from BBC News at the end of July. On a day in the summer, towards the end of July, the Ethiopian government had put in place a project in which they planted 350 million trees in one day. So they claimed they'd broken the world record. And it's a wonderful example, because what they were trying to do was to build resilience to climate change in the natural world. So they were trying to cut down their risks of flooding, because where they had no vegetation cover, the flooding was washing off the topsoil and so on. Planting the trees means the reduction in the flooding and holding on to those the valuable topsoil. But in that they were building resilience in the natural environment. Obviously fantastic work, fantastic outcomes as well for the built environment, more shading, the urban heat island effect would be lessened by trees and so on. And there was, and that obviously is going to have a knock-on effect on psychological resilience. So if people feeling like they can do something, they're coming together for a common goal, It was just a really nice example of how resilience in the human spirit can mean resilience in the natural world and resilience in the built environment. Thank you.